Started, we'll have some people probably join in as they do, but first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to our annual weather update by L. Dutcher. We seem to always get a good crowd for this every year. On behalf of the Chamber Ag Committee, we feel it's important. We feel it affects not necessarily, the weather affects everyone, affects our ag community, but also, it's interesting to go back and look at some of these updates year after year and say, how accurate were we at, or what changed? So without further ado, we for sure want to welcome Al. I do want to have a couple housekeeping items, as Jeannie just stated. Please mute yourself. Jess is going to go ahead and make sure we mute everyone, but please be respectful of the speaker. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat and we'll address those as we can at the end. We are going to, Al thinks his presentation will be about 30-35 minutes. We'll have time for some question and answer period after that. We do need to be done by 12:50 for another engagement, so please respect that as well. To kind of introduce Al, everybody knows who he is, but he received his Bachelor of Science degree in meteorology and Master of Science degree in agriculture climatology from Iowa State in 1985 and 1989. He began working at UNL as operations climatologist in 1989 and was promoted to state climatologist in 1991. Al remained state climatologist through 2016 and has been in his current position as an agricultural extension climatologist with the Nebraska State Climate Office since then. He is actively involved in agricultural weather, climate risk analysis, historical climate risk analysis, along with short and long-term weather forecasting. Some of the product development that he's been involved with in the Nebraska State Climate Office include soil moisture monitoring, irrigation scheduling, thermal tracking of crops and insect development, cattle comfort indices, interactive climate trends, and interactive climate normals atlas. We all see him on market journal updates. So Al, without further ado, here you go.
All right, thank you very much, folks. I wish it was under better circumstances that I was here. We're dealt with the cards that we are dealt with, and hopefully before this semester, next spring semester is over, we'll be back to more regular schedule. At least there was a little bit more optimism in terms of our conference call with the administration here a couple days ago. We'll wait to see whether or not this plays out, but we're dealt with what we're dealt with. Those of you that haven't seen me before, I'm going to share one slide before we get to the main brunt of it to kind of give you an idea of my perspective on how I look and analyze weather data. And so what I'm going to do, first of all, is share my screen with you, and then we'll go through this presentation and we'll try to answer some questions at the end, and hopefully I can give you at least a reasonable shot of getting the things right. Now, if I can get this thing to open, there we go. So one of the primary, well, sometimes things don't work the way you want it. One of the primary forecasting criteria that I use is what we consider to be the present ENSO phase. And really, ENSO is El Nino Southern Oscillation. So what I'm saying is, are we in an El Nino, or are we in a La Nina, or are we on the cold or warm side of the equation? Those have a lot of bearing on hemispheric patterns across the globe, particularly as we go through the fall, the winter, and into the spring period. Less of an impact during the summertime. But even with those, there's no guarantee that some of the trends that we see under the different types of scenarios, either La Nina or El Nino, there are other things that do drive the weather. And one of those is what we call the North Atlantic Oscillation. And in simple terms, what we're looking for is whether or not a blocking pattern, upper air ridge develops over the north central Atlantic. When that occurs, we generally see a fairly large trough across the eastern United States. Nebraska tends to be on the western periphery of that trough. And its limitations generally are the Rocky Mountains, because the cold air that is dense at the surface is not deep enough to slide over top of the Rockies, and that uses it as a barrier. So when that's in play, we tend to have more Arctic intrusions. When we don't have that blocking high pressure in the North Atlantic, we tend to see the troughing action move over to the western United States, and that's associated with the Gulf of Alaska upper air low. And generally these go through a 6 to 8 week sequence. Regardless of whether you're in an El Nino or La Nina, these patterns change on a regular basis. The reason I mention this is if you look at this fall period, because we don't have a lot of time to go through all of these things, I could probably spend about 3 hours going through this talk. But if you look at this fall period, from about the 1st of September through the 3rd week of October, we were dominated by colder than normal conditions. And I'll show you a couple slides here in a little bit. But we've seen 2 major snow events here in Nebraska alone. The one, of course, Labor Day week that we got the northern half of the Panhandle, and then a fairly significant upslope snow event the 3rd week of October. At the same token, if you look to the south of us, there's been in north central Oklahoma, south central portions of Kansas, and then that extends all the way into north central Texas. They've had 3 snowstorms already and 2 ice storms. And here in Nebraska, we've had 1 ice storm. These are fairly consistent patterns that we see with very aggressive La Nina type upper atmospheric considerations, meaning that the stronger the event, generally the bigger intensity of your Arctic outbreaks and the deeper they penetrate to the south of us. And unfortunately for us, we kind of get caught in the drier area of this, meaning as these systems come out of the north, we don't have a lot of moisture to work with. And it isn't until they get to the southern plains where they're able to lift that Gulf moisture up. So they tend to form along that frontal boundary and they kind of miss us to the south and the east. And that's exactly what many of these systems have done so far this fall. So right now, when I talk about present mean wave position, we've been in this troughing pattern that's been more conducive to seeing storm systems come in the Pacific Northwest. We've seen a warmer pattern, but if we take the counts and go forward, we should be starting to turn the corner here in the next couple of weeks to a renewal of energy going into the eastern U.S. trough. That doesn't guarantee Arctic air. It just means that we increase our likelihood that that's going to happen. And then, of course, snow cover plays an important role in the wintertime. The greater the snow cover, the less moderation of air masses. So the position of that snow cover means a great deal in regards to our climate, particularly during La Nina events. And we'll get to that in a second here. And the last and final thing that I look for is the anomaly of temperatures in eastern Alaska and the Yukon Territory. You will note if you look at CPC sites and pay attention to Alaska, especially eastern Alaska, usually that will lead, what you see up there will follow within about 10 to 14 days. So we've seen the cold anomalies. We're starting to show up there a couple of weeks ago. The suspicion is at some point that will release down into the lower 48. And depending on where it flows, determines who gets the Arctic air. For the most part this winter, the most immediate flow or the coldest temperatures when these anomalies occur have occurred over north central through south central portions of the United States in the middle third of the country. And in each of these big successive Arctic air outbreaks, we've seen anywhere from a 20 to a 45-degree temperature swing to the below normal side. The greatest of those anomalies were in Texas, but here in Nebraska, with both of those frontal boundaries, we were running 25 to 40 degrees below normal. And in fact, the October snow or the October event in the Panhandle, we haven't officially declared anything. We're waiting for NCEI to declare it, but it appears that Alliance set an all-time record low of -14 for the month of October. And by all accounts, that going back to the 1890s is the coldest October reading that we've seen anywhere in the state of Nebraska. So even though we know we talk about global climate change, it is the extremes that cause us the problems. And that's one of these situations that has just happened this fall. Even with these periods of warm weather, we have had extreme temperatures. Last winter, when I talked to the folks in Columbus and so those of you were there, you remember I talked about the potential for La Nina development, and I was fearful that we would see a drying pattern to establish the second half of the summer. The major concern was whether or not that was going to invade eastern Nebraska. And I've always played the snowpack in the Central Rockies as a primary forecast tool for the availability of drought to develop in Nebraska during the summertime. When we went into April, we were above normal snowpack, about 120% of normal. By the time we got the 1st of May, we had dropped down to normal. So we weren't outside the bounds of where we could say comfortably that we probably weren't going to see a drought. Usually we need 120% of normal, but we weren't down below that 80% range where we typically have seen drought development in every instance that I've been here at the university. But those patterns did develop, and the intensification across the Southern Rockies led to the heat being pulled into our region, particularly western Nebraska. and that started in early June. It transferred into the eastern portions of the state as we got into the month of August and basically overwhelmed a lot of the Corn Belt. And you can see the results of this continuous dryness is that we have D3 conditions across a substantial portion of the western part of the state. Now, those D3 conditions in the southwest were introduced in the last 7 days, and it's primarily the result of just not lack of precipitation this fall. So we had the drought, and now we're sitting at very poor subsoil moisture recharge for the fall period, and it's really across the entire state, but it's most pronounced across the western 1/3 of the state. So the bottom line, before we go any farther, if you're expecting to see major drought monitor changes over the next 3 months, that is highly unlikely. If we're going to see changes and improvements, the area that's most primed to see that is the eastern 1/3 of the state, where we've seen the more aggressive precipitation patterns. And even there, the only change we've seen in the drought monitor was the area from east central Nebraska northward to just south of Columbus was dropped 1 category a couple of weeks ago. And even then, I was concerned that it might be just a little bit too early based on the dryness we've seen in the last fall. But we've got time to rectify that. If it turns dry, it'll return back to D2 conditions like it was previously. But overall, the vast majority of the most intense dryness is situated from the central Rocky Mountains southward. If you look to the north, we're just starting to see some short-term dryness showing up there. That's not uncommon in the wintertime. The real key for them is as we get into late May and June, with an above normal snowpack in the northern Rockies, usually that will translate downstream, which would be the eastern Montana, western North Dakota, into above normal moisture. So I'm not overly concerned about this area at this point in time. But the key issue is this La Nina event. This is a classic La Nina signal. This is basically the sea surface temperature anomalies. Notice a big cold pool. What I will draw your attention to, and I apologize, I must have messed up and put the wrong slide in here because this is about 14 days old. But what you'll notice from this slide is that the Gulf of Alaska looks fairly above normal in terms of temperatures, and you see that big warm pocket. Well, over the last month, that warm pocket was essentially in the northern Gulf of Alaska. It has now shifted toward the southwest. And if I would have put the right slide in here, what you would notice is that all of the northern Gulf of Alaska and the eastern Gulf of Alaska is now into colder than normal conditions. And if you look basically off of California, you see that little blob of blue. And if you go toward the southwest, it looks like it's trying to connect a channel into the central equatorial Pacific. The reason I mention this is because I'm watching the Gulf of Alaska as a precursor to whether or not this goes into a second-year event. And it's going to require the Gulf of Alaska to turn colder than normal and to continue to feed those below normal sea surface anomalies into the central equatorial Pacific for this to maintain itself into a second year. And it's not unusual to see the storm activity in the Gulf of Alaska turn temperatures down to the cool side in the wintertime. It's when we get into March, whether or not we start to see it returning back to above normal temperatures. If it doesn't, then that's probably a pretty good guarantee that this is going into a second-year event. Now, the most current update was issued a month ago. We'll begin a new one next week. But from CPC standpoint, they have aggressively indicated that this La Nina event now has a 95% probability of lasting all the way through the winter period and a 65% probability of lasting through the spring. So they've upped that probability to almost 15% to make it all the way through the spring period. And that's critical for us because the decay of that event, or going back to what we call the cool side of normal, when that occurs in the early part of the summer, then generally it transposes into an above normal precipitation pattern across the northern plains and most of central and eastern Corn Belt. And one of the things that we looked at in the 2012 drought in western Nebraska, because of the serious implications it had on pastures, was what happens the year after a major drought. And what we found is that 70% of the time, the next year, January through December, precipitation was actually greater than the year before. And of that 70%, 50% of those values were greater than 4 inches above normal, or over 15% above their annual precipitation totals. Of the 30% that were below normal, 50% of those were within 2 inches of the previous year, and the remainder were over 2 inches below the previous year. So when you take this out in a return period or return based on the data that we have, 1 out of every 6 events is actually going to be worse than the previous year. So there's your good news. And if you think about it, 50% of them are normal to above normal. So there's a high probability that we will see a recovery in terms of precipitation. And usually that recovery is dictated on how quickly this event itself dies. So if CPC is right, we are going to have an above normal year. It's just we got to pay attention to this multi-year anomaly if it does develop, because generally the same conditions that established in year one will establish again in year two. And that's why we're looking at the southern plains, because that drought is so intense that even with recovery during the first half of the year, if we go into a multi-year event, we're liable to see the same type of upper atmospheric pattern redevelop as it goes into the fall period, or excuse me, the late summer period. So,
hey Al, real quick,
yes.
Can you? We had one comment. Can you like actually turn on the slideshow, and that may make the maps a little bigger?
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize for that. You get going on this and you forget about this stuff. How does this look?
There you go. Perfect.
I apologize, folks. This getting through all these Zoom little idiocracies can be a real pain sometimes, but we'll try to do better for you. These are the specific La Nina regions, or ENSO region, and I'm just going to go over them briefly. 1 and 2 is just off of the coast of South America, and El Nino 3 is about that first 1/3. El Nino 3.4 is the region that they use to quantify the intensity of La Nina. And if you look, we've seen that peak out around 1.5 degrees below, 1.5 Celsius below normal, the 1st of November, right around the end of October. Then we've seen a gradual warm up, only to see that has now cooled down, and we're getting another slight warm up, but there's another cold pocket that is coming up that's likely to bring this back down to 1.5. Why is 1.5 important? Because that's the criteria between the movement of a moderate event to a strong event. That's the minimum we need to see for a strong event. And that plays a lot in our snowfall statistics. But if you look at the central equatorial Pacific, which is El Nino 4 or Nino 4 region, it's flatlined. We're not seeing any change there. That's a very stable region, and that's part of the reason why we're likely to see this event, and CPC agrees that this event will last through the spring, is that we're not seeing much in the way of any easing off of conditions. And even the areas where we're seeing easing off of conditions have returned back to colder conditions. We should see this peak out in the next 30 to 45 days, and then we will start to gradually see it weaken. It's a question of how quickly it weakens. Well, some of that can be taken from below the surface. And if you think about it, the winds are moving from east to west, and during La Ninas are just stronger than normal. So we get that cold water pushed farther toward the Indonesia region. Well, the water has no place to go but below the surface. Can you be pushed along the surface, along the coastline? But when you got to realize Australia is right there on the west side of your screen. So it hits Australia and it's pushed underneath. So what we've seen is, as this thing is intensified this fall, you'll see this big anomalous pool here is warmed up. Now, as this pool is warmed up, it's slowly spread under the central equatorial Pacific, but it really hasn't made a tremendous volume of inroads over the last 30 days. So essentially, we're kind of in a balance mode right now. But you'll notice there's one big pulse coming up to the surface in the eastern equatorial Pacific. That will be the last reinforcing shot of cold. So the question is, as that comes to the surface and starts to move westward, will this warm water finally move underneath of it and start to come up to the surface? And that's the underlying question. If it doesn't occur this year, it will definitely occur the second year. There's just too much heat pooled here. But what I've noticed over the last 30 days is that this area that intensified early November, as it moved eastward, it's like the cold air is kind of offset it, or cold water is offset it somewhat, so it's weakened somewhat in the central equatorial Pacific. I've watched these things in the past 6 months for a parcel of water to get from one end of the equatorial Pacific to the other end. So if you look at where that position is right now, it would take a minimum of 3 months for that warm water to make it up to the surface and push out that channel of cold out ahead of it. And then it still has to make it across the equatorial Pacific into the central equatorial Pacific to weaken it at the surface in order for this event to completely die out. So that's 3 more months. So that takes us into early June. That would be the earliest that we would expect to see this event completely die out. Said I've shown this in the past. This is for the viewers out there that have not seen me talk. There is a strong tendency for La Nina conditions to dominate during the winter mode, and generally the summer is summertime in the southern hemisphere, and that's where we see the biggest returns. There is some anomalies in North America. The strongest are during the October-April period for drier than normal conditions across the southern 1/3 of the United States. So the drought in the southern plains is most likely going to be supported over 70% of the time by this La Nina anomaly. But look at South America, and this is the one I want to caution you about because I have a feeling some producers are going to get caught with their pants down on this one. There's been a lot of recovery on the soybean prices here since the dry conditions this fall. We've seen a big run up. And now I see folks that are playing the game, and I see watching the blogs, and I just shake my head at this, that they have not learned to look at statistical analysis of these events. The last 8 La Nina events brought 7 consecutive record soybean yields out of Brazil. The last one was not a record, but it was still 4 or 5% above trend line yields. The bottom line is that think of soybeans down there in terms of the North America. It is the 1st of December here. It's the 1st of June there in comparison to our summer. Soybean is made with the rains as long as you can keep them alive during the August period. So their soybeans are going to be made during the February period. And the rains are just starting to materialize spottily across this region. The most likely area for drought is typically in Argentina, which impacts the corn crop. You look at Australia, you notice the wet anomaly there. You look at South Africa, the wet anomaly there. We have seen tremendous rainfall across Australia ever since the fires were put out. They're big fires that come with the El Nino event, and they've been wet ever since. I expect their biggest issue is going to be too wet of conditions during harvest, but we should have a big wheat crop coming out of Australia, and we should have a big corn crop coming out of South America or South Africa. So the big question is if you feel lucky, do you want to go against statistical odds that point strongly toward the likelihood that we will see trend line to above trend line yields in soybeans in Brazil? If that does materialize, you're going to see some pretty big pullbacks across the United States. And if CPC continues their forecast in the future, which is pointing toward wet conditions for the entire growing season across the major corn growing areas of the United States, there'll be further fireworks as we go into the spring period. Right now, I think the drought is probably holding things back a little bit. Now, this is a consolidated forecast from all the models across the globe. I will caution you that these models have not performed very well. The only models that perform well in terms of picking this La Nina event out are the coldest models. There's 4 of them that are below the blue line, which is the average of all of these models. All those models you see that are showing it warming right now, every single one of them had an El Nino event going on for this fall, not a La Nina event. In fact, the Potsdam Institute made a big deal about their new model that had a 70+% accuracy in forecasting El Nino and La Nina events well over a year in advance. They were calling for an El Nino, so they put it out for their first year egg on the face. Now, maybe they do have a high accuracy rate and they just picked the wrong period, but it isn't a good sign when you're predicting an El Nino and a very, very strong La Nina event itself develops. So you have to take these models with a grain of caution. I usually look at the models that are performing the best as a precursor until they fail. And right now, the coldest models are essentially doing the best. And if you look at all these cold models, they still, by the time we get into June, July, August period, keep us in -0.5 to the -0.1 range, which is a weak La Nina event. That's why I feel more confident that this event likely will go on past this summer and into next fall, particularly if the Gulf of Alaska is also a contributing factor in this allocation. So want to get you to some trends here real quick, because I know that we're getting into the winter mode and we got these warm temperatures. Does that mean we're going to stay warm for the winter? Well, CPC and I talked about these statistical anomalies that we see during La Nina falls, and one of the ones that is a primary influence for our region is warm and dry conditions during the fall period during La Ninas. If you look at the fall temperature pattern, you'll notice Nebraska is slightly above normal. We would call within the normal range, but it's toward the warmer side. To the north and the south, it was colder than normal. We were very fortunate this last month that we averaged about 4 to 5 degrees above normal across the state. That's why we are seeing an anomaly of 0 to 2 for the fall period. But if we look at this in a more detailed analysis, if we look at the temperature trend, you can see our 6 to 8 degrees across the northern part of the state And by the time you take the average area out, we come in that 5-degree range. But when we look at the fall precipitation pattern, it's been dry. I will draw your attention to the south of us. Notice that spotty precipitation from essentially north central Texas all the way up into eastern Ohio. That's that mean position of that funnel boundary I was talking about when the Arctic air surges down. And unfortunately, when we get into the situation, you can almost see from a southwest or northeast direction, that's the mean position of the front side of the trough. So you got warm air aloft. You got cold air sliding in from the north of the surface. It's very dense. It undercuts that warm air. It gets lifted up over the cold air. And that's the result you typically see during La Nina, is an increase in icing events. For us, we generally don't deal with significant icing events in the fall period. This was more of an unusual anomaly under that case. We deal with more of these during the light freezing events during the winter, but more importantly, in that March to mid-April period is a very, very dangerous time for the western half of the state, because we still get those Arctic air surges with the active weather starting to develop to our south. And that tends to be when our highest odds of icing are. I apologize, I didn't show the one slide here, but what I wanted to show was the anomalies for September and October when we were under the eastern U.S. trough. And that center 1/3 of the country that I just showed you was consistent even across Nebraska of below normal temperatures for those 2 months. So we can see some of that in that previous slide right here. What's the residual of that? The difference between when we look to get the November out of this data is that you see more uniformity all the way down to Texas with this colder anomaly. So that's kind of the warning that I have for folks. Don't interpret the first couple of weeks of a season as what the season is going to be. It's when does it break toward the cold side, and when that cold breaks, how intense is that cold? That will really determine your anomalies during the winter. It's not the longevity of the event, it's the intensity of the events compared to those periods when you're not that cold. So this is a very important fact that I want to bring across to everybody. We know that we entered the end of the growing season with little of any subsoil moisture. If there was subsoil moisture, it was very deep in the profile. Surfaces were dried out. So we have a pretty good representation of what has gotten back into the profile since September. If you were to assume that Mother Nature didn't need any of this moisture for growing crops or pastures that were still green to the warm conditions. So in the most optimistic scenario, 70% of this moisture got into the profile. And typically that's what we look at for the fall through the spring period, is we know that we're going to have some frozen events. We know the ground's going to freeze for part of the time. We know we're going to have some evaporation. Consistently, we found that about 70% of the moisture will make it into the profile. So if you take that into consideration, in the best case scenario, and that's that area to the east of Norfolk and Columbus, in the purple here, which has had between 4 3/4 to around 5.5 inches. If you take that by 70%, we've gotten soil moisture down in that 1 to 1.5 foot range. However, once you go from Grand Island westward, where we see the yellows, and that's where we've had better precipitation than we have in western Nebraska, recharges are basically in the 1 1/4 to 1 3/4 inch range. And for western Nebraska, we haven't had a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch of recharge across the region. So that's why we're seeing this intensification. We've got to make up this moisture sometime. And here's our deficits that we've accumulated this fall. So most of the center part of the state is running over 3 inches below normal already for the soil moisture recharge. Translated from this point forward, if we were to get normal precipitation through the spring and into the growing season, based on studies that were done in the early 80s, you're already looking at dryland yield reduction in northeast Nebraska with that 3.75, it pushes up around 4. You're already looking at 10% yield reduction on dryland corn if we don't see an aggressive wet pattern develop. This is just based on normal going forward, and that's why there's concern. So we're not going to see a lot of recovery during the winter period. Our best bet is during the spring. And the longer it holds off, the more dire the situation gets. We're going to be living rainfall event all the way into the first half of the summer at least. So this is not going away anytime soon. Hopefully, or depending on your perspective, we can get a couple of late season wet winter snows. Those are the ones that really help to juice up the surfaces a little bit. and provide moisture as the temperatures warm up for convective development. We'll see whether or not that materializes, but right now, this is eerily like 2011. The only difference between 2011 fall and this fall is the temperatures were considerably warmer during the 2011 fall. So we've had the cold offset some of the demands that the heat in 2011 fall brought before we've seen the 2012 drought. I've shown this in the past, but I want to show it again. And the first two lines are all the strong events, and the third line from the left to the right, those three events are considered to be strong events. So they have at least had a minus 1.5 degrees Celsius in the 3.4 Nino region. Of these 11 events, 7 of them were below normal temperatures for Nebraska, and only 4 of them were above normal. So essentially, the odds do favor below normal temperatures. When you look at the precipitation, it's a little bit more uncertain because this is a dry period for us. But I want to draw your attention to those top two rows and the third row from left to right for the first 3 graphics. Notice that wet anomaly to our south consistently in these forecasts. That's the position of the jet stream with the colder infiltration that sets up across the southern plains. To the north and west of there, it's drier than normal. Within that frontal boundary into the east-southeast of it, it's wetter than normal. Where is it setting up? Almost identical where it's setting up this year. And in this case, 7 of the 11 events had that same anomaly to the south of us. That's why we use statistics in climatology, because this is strong correlations. When you get above 70%, that's a pretty strong return that you can pretty much guarantee is going to occur in most instances. So you'll notice in Nebraska, it can be just about anywhere, but when you're only getting on average on a statewide basis in the western half of the state, an inch to an inch and a quarter to an inch and a half of moisture during that 3-month period, compared to 2 to 2.5 inches in the eastern part of the state. It only takes one system, wet, juicy system at the beginning of the winter or at the end of the winter that can give you half of your total annual or total winter precipitation. So these are just winter anomalies. Remember, our winter grows more than just these 3 months in terms of snowfall. It extends a lot farther out into the spring, and it usually starts a lot earlier than this. So these statistics can be a little bit misleading, but for snow lovers, maybe these statistics may not be so much in your favor. We finally, NOAA has done analysis of La Nina snow anomalies. And if you combine all the snow events together, all La Ninas together, there is something apparent that comes out. A strong anomaly across the upper Mississippi River Valley in the eastern Dakotas, and a dry anomaly from the southwest panhandle through southwest Nebraska and all the way down into the Texas panhandle. However, the strength of that strength of the event really dictates where these anomalies set up. So for weak events, we see more widespread snowfall all the way through the central Corn Belt, eastern Nebraska, north central Nebraska, northeast Nebraska, all the way up northward through most of the Dakotas. We still see a strong dryness anomaly. In fact, the strongest of the dryness anomaly during La Nina events tends to occur in weak events for the southwestern part of the state and the southern panhandle. But once we move into strong events, notice the absence of strong snow anomalies here in the Central Plains. In fact, we have a fairly strong dry anomaly just to the north of the Columbus area, across northeast Nebraska, northwest Iowa, and north central Nebraska, as well as central South Dakota into south central North Dakota. We see a weaker anomaly in the southwest and the southern panhandle, but a much stronger dry anomaly in southwestern Kansas, Texas panhandle, and northern New Mexico. When we go to a moderate event, which CPC and NOAA did not put on this graphic, but I've had access to it, that snow anomaly that you see to our north actually falls farther southward across northern Montana, North Dakota, into northeastern South Dakota. So because this event has reached a strong stage, we would expect that most likely the scenario for snowpack is that the major anomalies are going to remain to our north across southern Canada. Remember what I said, these are anomalies. This isn't a snow cover. This is anomalies above what they normally get. So that means a deeper snowpack. That means less moderation for Arctic air, and more of that is likely to influence itself into our region than we would if this was absence of that big snow anomaly and we had bare ground. It would tend to be modified quicker. So let's look at the current snow depth. Kind of looks like that strong anomaly. See the snow anomaly up in southern Canada. So the snow is there to help reinforce the cold. It's just that the cold hasn't got here yet, and it may not. Because the one thing about this is when this fails, as a climatologist, it fails miserably. It's either going to be cold and snowy to the north, or it's going to be very warm and very dry. And there's really not much in between. So I'm going to either look like a hero or a zero based on what we're seeing right now. But overall, based on what the fall trend and seeing the couple surges of the Arctic air that we had as they slid down the front side of the Rocky Mountains, my suspicion is that type of pattern will return once the eastern U.S. trough itself develops. So it really becomes a matter of trying to figure out when the timing of the event itself occurs. So we'll briefly give you CPC's thoughts. This is their outlooks, rolling outlooks. And the most important to me is the top line because it dictates our winter period. So we're not going to look at the next 3 months, but this was issued out into the long leads, and that's for the January through March period, February through April period, and March through May period. You can see they're consistently keeping that cold anomaly to our north. And we're caught between the very warm to the south and the cold to our north. One thing that we do know with La Niñas, and particularly strong La Niña events, is we typically see a very aggressive severe weather season in the spring, particularly in Texas, Oklahoma, in southern Kansas. And those usually occur during that April and the late March through the late April period, sometimes into the early May period. Why is that important? Because that cold air gets down there, you get those big troughs developing, the spin down there, but the cold air is in place over northwest Nebraska, and the overrunning moisture is what gives us those big late season snowstorms and occasional blizzards. And in this year, we're really going to need it. I know producers probably don't want to see that during calving season, but to me, that would be a good sign that we're starting to move toward a wetter pattern and break some of the dryness anomalies that we've seen across the western part of the state. Here's your rolling 3 month. And if you notice this, you don't see an aggressive precipitation pattern in our region during the winter time. But once we start getting into the April, May, June period, that dry anomaly disappears and we start to see an expanding wet anomaly as indicated by CPC. So this is what I was getting at. If the La Niña event itself dies down, and remember that this CPC is going off the consolidated forecast for all these ENSO criteria, and they all say that by the end of the spring, it should end. So when they look at those type of statistical analysis, this is what it shows: widespread precipitation across the entire Corn Belt. So what I would advise folks here is there's a lot of risk here going forward both ways, either wet or dry. And one could argue either way and I would have no arguments against them until we actually see the proof in the pudding. So have a game plan in place, because if this type of a pattern develops this upcoming year, particularly as we get into the warm season, that's not going to be positive for grain prices. It's going to be a negative because we will be looking at above normal trend line yields, particularly when you look at the anomalies across that are expected to be above normal moisture across all the central and eastern Corn Belt. Plus the irrigation in Nebraska, which we don't have any limitations this year that I'm aware of, and most likely won't see any limitations to the Platte watershed until next year. We have ample supplies upstream due to the very wet conditions over the last 5 or 6 years. So even this one dry year has not put us behind the 8 ball yet, but 2 consecutive years will. So we're going to have that irrigation also to add fuel to the fire. So the only hope that you have is the anomalies that you see on the first 3 lines, if you want prices to continue to skyrocket forward, is for this anomaly to hold all the way through next fall period. Generally, that's probably not going to occur. Remember, I said 1 in 6 chance that the conditions will be worse next year based on precipitation following a drought year. So the odds there also point against that. So here's my thoughts, and I'll try to wrap these up quick. I expect winter temperatures to be below normal. I wrote an article for the Nebraska Cattleman magazine. I have not changed that. It's just a matter of when does this cold air come in. We should be coming into the swing into an eastern U.S. trough becoming a dominant force. In fact, the GFS model has kind of been hinting that we're starting to see a breakdown of the U.S. trough in the west and more cold air starts to funnel into our region. The question is, how deep does it go into the central and southern plains? That's where the GFS model is having a big time trying to resolve, and the solutions are changing every day. But it is zeroing in on the 12th and beyond to start to see a pattern change. In fact, that's also being shown by CPC. CPC has actually now started to show a below normal temperature anomaly over the northern Rockies during that same time period. The best chances for us to see good snowfall would be when we get back to a western U.S. trough. So that would be another 6 to 8 weeks beyond the eastern U.S. trough, which would put my target time frame for above normal moisture in that early February through mid-March period. And then we would repeat the same type of a scenario because we are in La Nina. We were building in La Nina last fall. We're in La Nina now. We'd expect the same conditions next spring, probably a tendency toward warmer and drier conditions during the planting period, with the precipitation, if it's going to come, is going to occur during the May and June period. So we'll wait to see whether or not that happens. Again, I mentioned the icing events. As we go into the spring, the best chance for above normal temperature to be across the southeast, closer to the core area to our south. Below normal to the northwest is exactly what happened last spring. I expect a repeat performance of that. The intensity of that below normal will be determined by how aggressive the troughing action is. I've already mentioned the snows in the southeast and the northwest. The northwest is really coupled with the severe weather outbreaks expected across the southern plains, since they're far to the northwest of that region. Similar planting conditions. Here's where things get interesting. If this La Nina holds through the spring, I expect the severe weather outbreak to be significant across Kansas and Nebraska as we go into the May and June period. This is likely to be an above normal severe weather year, so keep that in the back of your mind. La Nina years usually do portend to some exceptionally strong severe weather outbreaks. It's not always there, but based on the patterns we've seen, or I've seen with these upper air lows and the strength of them, I suspect that we'll be dealing with those issues as we go into the spring period. Unfortunately, when you have strong changes to 23 degrees below normal temperatures to 23 degrees above normal temperatures, you get yourself set up for a freeze risk. Big ridge builds up, Arctic air slides in, one of these troughs pass through, you get these hard April, early April freeze events. And I'm not talking 28 degrees, I'm talking into the teens like we had in the early 90s, one of those major events. You always got to be aware that that can happen. Snowpack is going to be a big one because really the odds point toward above normal snowpack in the northern Rockies, but until it materializes, I'm not going to feel confident that we can see the drought reduce itself in western Nebraska. If we can continue to see favorable snowpack all the way through the spring period, I think that that will help to offset to some extent that drought, at least initially overwhelming western Nebraska as early in the summer as they did this last year. So that's going to be a key. And that goes along with this the March-April period in the northwest part of the state. Those wet, aggressive storms from big severe weather outbreaks in the southern plains usually translates to big upslope snows in the Rocky Mountains, and that's the headwater region of the Platte River Valley. The eastern Corn Belt is the one to watch for problems during planting. They usually have a 70% to 80%, depending on where you are within that region, likelihood of very wet conditions during the winter and into the spring period. And usually planting delay issues become an issue with them. We've seen some good recovery in parts of Iowa and Illinois this fall. They've got some big rainfall events. So there's some pockets there that could potentially have some similar problems. Where the real issue will become is how aggressive will the spring precipitation be in these regions. It seems they're to the east of us and generally have about 6 to 8 inches more precipitation than we do on an annualized basis. Their odds increase dramatically for that. Finally, in the summer, if this event dies early, I expect us to see a very bountiful summer precipitation pattern across the entire Corn Belt. If this pattern holds on, expect the dryness to return in earnest for the central and southern plains as we get the second half of the summer. Areas south of Interstate 80 would have the highest likelihood of seeing significant drought implications. Snowpack will determine how far northward in the central and northern Rockies, how far northward that initial surge of heat will materialize. But if we go through a second year, I firmly think that we will see a repeat performance in terms of soybeans, particularly I-80 southward, as we go through that month of August and September. Also, generally on the second year, when you break down and the pattern breaks down or max out, shouldn't say max out, reaches its peak in the fall of the second year, it falls apart rapidly. And if you look at what is there, usually what you do is you go from a La Nina cycle to an El Nino cycle back and forth. So the warm's there. If that was to occur, then we would see a much more aggressive precipitation pattern taking place across the southern United States as we go into late next fall and next winter. And that would translate to probably some pretty significant improvements across the southern and central Rockies in terms of the drought situation that they were seeing. But that's a long way out. I've already mentioned the drought likelihood in the Sandhills region. That's what the statistics are based on. But having been in this business long enough, I know that a lot of the areas have a similar type of tendency as the Western Sandhills, and that's why I'm confident that the most likely scenario is that we are going to see a much more improved precipitation pattern for this next coming year. What the statistics don't tell you is when does that precipitation fall? And that's what makes this game really tough. If it occurs in the spring, we can get a lot of subsoil moisture build up rather rapidly. We just hope it doesn't shut off during the second half of the summer. So the hope is that this will slowly die down, at least from a Nebraska perspective. We get our planting done, the moisture returns, and we slowly weaken this as we go into the first half of the summer and return to a regular precipitation pattern. I'm kind of keeping my fingers crossed on that right now. And until I see the Gulf of Alaska and how it acts, I'm going to go with that forecast. But keep in mind, we're paying close attention to that Gulf of Alaska. And if that turns cold and stays cold, this is going into a second year event. So I'm going to wrap it up right here. I'm glad to entertain any questions. Hopefully I've given you some things to think about and to track. One of the things hopefully I got this. One of the things that we've been doing here is that I did put a winter weather outlook out on the Nebraska website, Nebraska Climate website. It also links to a lot of the graphics I've shown you here that I've done for snowfall analysis, temperature, and precipitation during La Nina events. We've also now moved to a weekly ag weather update from April through October. This will appear weekly, and it did this year. I will do a summary of the past week, do a crop summary, and also put out a 2-week to 4-week outlook depending on what's showing up in the models. Once we get past October, we go to a bi-monthly depending on when the until we get to 95% harvested on corn, soybean, and sorghum, we continue the weekly basis. But once we get past that, we go to bi-monthly. So I've issued one. We're going to get another one that'll be issued this week at the first of the month. Those will be a monthly summary on the ag using NAS statistics. The mid-month period will be a further La Nina update. So in 2 weeks, on Friday, 2 weeks from this Friday, there will be another update on this La Nina pattern on the website, give you my thoughts and see where we're going to go from there. We're also, if you are interested in the state climate summaries, those are load up about 10 days after the end of the month from the previous month. And I am also now starting to do seasonal climate outlooks under the special topics and special topics. You can see where you can get the general link there. There'll be a list of articles, and the most recent one will be at the top. So this is also where I will do your seasonal forecast and expand beyond what CPC is doing. Next year, if we can get back to a regular mode, that's asking a lot at this point in time, but we will move the monthly, or excuse me, the weekly ag report, weather report from a written publication into a podcast. So it'll much more easier, so you can listen and get your information, and don't have to sit there and pour through 2 pages of text and figures. This must be a much easier solution. So hopefully you can get some value out of this. Feel free to let us know if you do get a value out of this, or you'd like to see some changes in some of this stuff. But this will give you some more detailed information that you're probably not going to get with a market journal or a KRVN forecast update that we do a 3 or 4 minute spot each week on. So from that point, I think I've gone through everything I can. I'd be glad to entertain any questions if you have any.
Does anyone have any questions for Al briefly?
I do. I'm with the Telegram. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly. Can you, in an ideal scenario, what would the indicators be that producers should hope for or look for?
What producers need to hope for is that, you know, in terms of winter precipitation, the reality is that unless it's an unbelievably nasty winter with a lot of precipitation, we're not going to see a lot of changes in the drought monitor. What we need to hope for is that we return to an aggressive precipitation pattern next spring, particularly after we get planting done, because we have a lot of subsoil moisture to make up from this fall. Those deficits are running anywhere from 2 to 4 inches. We're running precipitation in terms of percent of normal that's running anywhere from 10% of normal in the southwest, south central part of the state to about 50% of normal across portions of east central Nebraska. So if those deficits are not made up and we receive normal precipitation from this point going forward, statistical analysis from the early 80s that was done by my predecessor, just a simple metric, found that you usually use about 2.5% of your baseline yield. So whatever you've got figured out with FSA for your acreage in terms of its trend change over time, we know that that's included in there, you would expect a 2.5% yield reduction for each inch you're shy of normal. So if we're carrying a 4-inch deficit in the next spring and don't make that up and have normal moisture next spring and next summer, you're probably already looking at a 10% yield reduction. And remember, we don't have the subsoil moisture down deep, so we've got to rebuild that ball back up. And that's why these statistics tend to work a little bit better, is simply because we know we're void of moisture, so we don't have to worry about not accounting for deep subsoil moisture that may be there, but in reality, it is not there. If that does not materialize, then get prepared for a drought. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There just will not be a substantial enough moisture unless it falls heavily during June to carry us through the entire cropping season. That's what happened this year. I had warned about that. The drying pattern would come to catch us up, and it caught up to us in a short order as we got into the month of July, in late July, across the entire Corn Belt. So that's the same situation we're set up for. Generally, we repeat the same type of patterns over the second year, and they tend to be more intense if the event carries on all the way through a second full year.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I think we'll wrap it up so we can get done in time. But on behalf of the Chamber Ag Committee, I want to thank everyone for participating today. I know we've had a very challenging 2020, and it looks like 2021 is going to start off the same. But I want to thank everyone for their involvement all year. And on behalf of the Chamber, wish everyone a happy and safe holiday season. And we're going to try to get back to as normal as we can in 2021. But I think you'll see us try to do some more things exactly like this, because participation via Zoom has helped a lot, but we sure do miss seeing everyone in person. So thank you, and we'll see everyone later. Thanks, Al.
You bet. And I'll slide this over to you when I get back to my taping so that you have a copy for your files.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Have a safe holidays.
Thank you. Thanks for letting us tape you, Al. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.